Hey everybody, Dr. Duncan here. This is our next video lecture installment on biodiversity. In the previous video lecture, we learned about how humanity has caused thousands of extinctions and massive reductions in the population sizes of many species. And apparently we're not through. Experts in the field project the loss of 1 million species by the end of this century. But is this a problem? Is it a crisis? Why should we care about biodiversity? If we can't answer these questions, then these forecasts will almost certainly come true, because people only protect what they understand and value. So in this video, we're going to examine the leading answers to the question, so what? Why save biodiversity? Let's begin with two types of value we can assign to something, intrinsic and instrumental. Intrinsic value is the value that something has as an end in itself. It's its own interests. For example, it's how most of us, and hopefully all of us, think about each other. We assign value to each other that is independent of whether or not someone is of personal value to ourselves. In the context of biodiversity, this would be saying that other species have a right to exist, regardless of whether those species are useful to us or not. Intrinsic valuation can be a powerful motivator to protect biodiversity in some cultures and for some individuals, myself included. I believe that other species should continue their existence on the planet that they call home. But the reality is that intrinsic value argument is not very convincing to many people, especially those whose livelihoods depend on practices that are driving the decline of biodiversity, whether that's a rancher clearing tropical forest in the Amazon or the CEO of a fossil fuel company. Thus, biodiversity advocates increasingly have turned to arguments about the instrumental value of biodiversity to humans. In contrast to intrinsic value, there is instrumental value. This is the value we place on something based on its usefulness to us. Another phrase that you'll often see instead of instrumental value is utilitarian value. It means the same thing. Instrumental valuation can be subdivided into each of four types of ecological services. The term ecological services refers to all the ways that we benefit from ecosystems and the biodiversity they contain. This concept is the most important idea to come out of the field of conservation science in recent decades. The four services are provisioning, cultural, regulating, and supporting. Because ecosystems exist through the interactions of species with each other and with their environment, ecosystem services are inextricably reliant on biodiversity. Let's take a look at each of these four categories. We'll begin with provisioning services. This is any type of benefit to people that can be extracted from nature. Water is a good example. It is something we depend on daily. This includes what we drink, what we wash with, the water we use to produce food and energy, and the water we use in the manufacturing of the stuff we buy. All that water, for all these purposes, is extracted from ecosystems. When ecosystems become degraded, or we interrupt the flow of water through the Earth's systems, water can become polluted and/or scarce. Another important example of a provisioning service is food production. Which of our foods do we get from nature? Well, many people around the world still rely on food harvested directly from the wild. Yes, this includes many indigenous peoples like the Inuits seen here, but it includes many others as well. It is estimated that 56% of people around the world rely on fish for 15% of their animal protein intake. The majority of these people, though, are relying on commercial fisheries. This is the practice of harvesting and selling animals captured in oceans, lakes, and rivers. There are fisheries for fish, of course, but also shrimp, squid, crab, and everything else we pull from the ocean and eat. Most fisheries capture animals from the wild, but some is raised in captivity via a process known as aquaculture. Even then, aquaculture is heavily reliant on natural ecosystems for the animals raised or the resources used to raise them. Food production as an ecological service also includes our domesticated crops. All of our crop species were developed through artificial selection from ancestral forms found in nature. The same is true for all the cows, chickens, and pigs and other animals that we raise and kill for meat. Food production through agriculture and the raising of livestock also relies on soils and water made available through ecological processes. So even though what you might eat each day might not look like it had anything to do with nature at all of it is a form of biodiversity, and its production relies on ecosystems. Another important example of a provisioning service is the use of medicines. Both traditional and modern medicine practices rely heavily on biodiversity. All those complex ecological relationships that you've studied, from herbivory to parasitism to predation, they have, through evolution, created millions of complex chemicals. And we humans have a long history of using these complex chemicals to help us survive. Even today, this is true. As it turns out, the 20 most sold drugs in the US are natural products that are either slightly modified directly from nature or chemicals discovered in nature and then manufactured in the lab. These drugs are used to fight everything from cancer to AIDS to malaria. Millions of unresearched organisms may yet provide future drugs. And it's also important to realize that much of the world doesn't go to the local Walgreens or CVS to get their medicines. They go out into the landscape. 60% of the global population relies on traditional medicines where they're gathering the chemicals that they use in their practices from the wild. An example of this, or an example of how we derive drugs from nature, is the rosy periwinkle. This was a species that was discovered to fight childhood leukemia cancer, and it has reduced deaths from 95% of children stricken with the disease to just 5%. The tropical rainforests and coral reefs of the world are chock full of new drugs waiting to be discovered. If we lose these ecosystems and the species within them, we are losing potentially important medicines, not just for us, but for every human generation to follow. There are several other categories of ways we extract things we need from ecosystems. 40% of the world relies on wood for cooking and heating. We continue to extract wood from natural and planted forests for making things, including lumber and furniture. We even wear biodiversity in the form of natural fibers, including cotton, wool, silk, and hemp. Another example of a provisioning service is the way we use ecosystems and biodiversity for information. This includes how we extract genes from one species and insert them into domesticated species to improve how much food is produced or how efficiently we produce that food. Information services also include using nature as inspiration for new tools and designs, a process known as biomimicry. Information services also include using nature as a way of gauging the health of our environment. For example, biologists and others use the diversity and population sizes of some species to determine the health of our rivers and forests. These species are the proverbial canaries in the coal mine. When they die off, we know we have problems. Okay, let's move on to regulating services, our second of our 4 ecological services. Regulating services are ecosystem processes that moderate natural phenomena. So, for example, floods are controlled by wetlands and floodplains alongside rivers. Wetlands protect coastlines from cyclones and tsunamis. Species of predator control pest species. Pollinating species pollinate a lot of our crops, and so forth and so on. These are all examples of regulating services. One that I'll call particular attention to is that of pollination. It turns out that 75% of the crop species that humans rely on globally are pollinated by wild animals. These animals reside in nearby natural ecosystems and migrate to agricultural areas where they pollinate our crops in the pursuit of nutrients and energy provided by flowers. Insects provide the vast majority of these services, but bats and birds and a few other animals contribute as well. Unfortunately, insect populations are on the decline the world over, and as this loss cuts into the populations of pollinators we rely on, this becomes an existential threat to humanity. The situation is even more critical when you consider that we'll be adding another 2 billion people to the planet by the year 2050, when most of you will be about the age of your parents. This is not a time to be losing our capacity to produce the foods on which we rely. Our third category of ecological service is cultural services. These are the non-material benefits that contribute to the development and advancement of culture. It's a pretty broad category. It includes recreation, education, aesthetics, creative inspiration, and psycho-spiritual value. A couple of examples are attractions, zoos, but that includes zoos and botanical gardens, and wild species in nature that attract nature tourists. Those are all examples of cultural services. Cultural services also include our companions, our pets. Service animals, however, would fall under provisioning services. Now, a more abstract form of cultural service is psycho-spiritual valuation. This is what biodiversity provides to benefit your psychological well-being, or, for many, the value biodiversity has based on your spiritual worldview. There are many different flavors of this. They include, for example, that we humans tend to prefer diversity to monotony. For example, we prefer to walk in a landscape where there's a diversity of plants and animals instead of just one or a couple of types of plants and animals. Many of us use nature as a place for quiet retreat and reflection. Some see and use nature as a form of spiritual inspiration or artistic inspiration. There's also that many people view nature as having a right to exist for either moral, ethical, religious, or spiritual reasons. These are all forms of valuing nature based on psycho-spiritual approaches. Can psychological value of a species be measured? Absolutely. Psychologists have examined this by asking people to imagine that they have learned that a species has gone extinct, and to respond whether and to what degree they feel some sense of sadness or loss. For example, if you were to learn that the African elephant was extinct, would you feel some degree of sadness? If so, that species has value to you, even though you may never see an African elephant. Our final category of ecological services is supporting services. These services include all the processes necessary for the production of all other ecosystem services. That includes nutrient cycling, soil formation, the hydrologic cycle, photosynthesis, and the production of oxygen by plants. Without these ecological services, it's game over. Okay, so I hope you're now convinced that no matter how far removed our lives seem to be from biodiversity and ecosystems, we are intimately dependent on nature for our survival. Not just our survival, but also our capacity to prosper and thrive, and also to derive value, meaning, and enjoyment from our lives. But still, a skeptic might point out that we have lost many species to extinction already, and many populations of species are significantly down in their numbers. Yet despite that, we're still here, doing fine, and the human population continues to grow. Given this, is species diversity really all that important to provide ecosystem services? Perhaps the first response to this question should be that much of the world is not doing fine. The deterioration of ecological services has made food, water, and materials scarce in many regions, especially developing countries where much of their natural resource base was extracted through many centuries of colonialism and post-colonialism. The unsustainable extraction and use of natural resources contributes to and exacerbates the high rates of poverty, disease, and misery around the world. So while you and I might be doing fine, increasingly much of the world is not. But even here in the developed world, we are paying for the deterioration of the natural environment through higher disease rates, declines in lifespan, and higher costs for food, water, and other goods and services due to a decline in ecological services. For example, We pay a higher price for water now than ever before because the water we extract from the environment is so contaminated with pollutants. But still, the question remains, why is the loss of species, or the loss in extent of ecosystems, related to our ability to survive? The answer to that question gets us back to ecology. There are several ways to demonstrate this. Let's start with food webs. You probably know that food webs show the feeding relationships among species in an ecosystem. Here's an example of a marine food web. Let's say that we overharvest and eliminate the herring species through commercial fishing. Those are the species represented by blue circles, and I've drawn a red oval around them. The removal of herring from the ecosystem has impacts on the many species they share feeding relationships with. The red arrows show the species that relied on the herrings as a primary source of food. This includes larger fishes such as salmon, which themselves are commercially valuable. It also includes birds and several marine mammals, including orcas. For any of them that were already endangered, as is often the case with top predators, the loss of their main prey species can be what causes their extinction. Meanwhile, the herring's prey species will increase in number, as represented by the green arrows. Finally, the loss of the herring might cause the populations of their competitors to increase, as indicated by the yellow arrows. This is not some hypothetical situation. Humanity has conducted this experiment many times over around the world. What generally happens is that we overharvest the most preferred species, then gradually fish our way through the ecosystem, sequentially removing species from the ecosystem until we're left eating organisms we once regarded as low-value food. The result, however, is an ecosystem that is way out of balance compared to what it was originally, with considerably reduced biodiversity and diminished ecological services. Sure, some species prosper in the new marine ecosystems. Jellies are one group that are doing quite well in many of these overfished ecosystems. But do we really want to trade salmon and orcas for an ocean full of jellyfish? I don't think so. An understanding of these types of impacts are not new to ecology. They've been around for over 40 years. One particularly instructive model of how biodiversity is related to ecological function and ecological services is the rivet hypothesis. This is the idea that ecosystem function increases with species richness. An analogy is used to explain how this works. The analogy is that ecosystems are like airplanes, and species are the rivets that hold planes together. Those would be the little nail-like bumps that you see on the wing of this aircraft in the picture at the lower right. If we lose a few rivets, the plane can still fly. But if we lose enough rivets, parts fall off the plane and the plane will crash. In other words, via extinctions and population reductions, ecosystems can collapse. Now, this hypothesis has been supported by several decades of science and largely found it to be true, that ecosystem functions do increase as there are more species in ecosystems, as illustrated with the graph at the top right. The conclusion here is that we need to keep ecosystems intact and population sizes healthy in order to avoid losing ecological services. This concept has been refined as we've learned more about how our ecosystems work. One newer version is the redundancy hypothesis. This hypothesis is explained by way of building on the rivet hypothesis. It focuses on ecosystem function instead of ecosystem composition. By analogy, species are like passengers on an airplane. They use space and resources, but they're not essential to the plane's airworthiness. Many species can be passengers. They come and go over long periods of time, and they perform similar functions to one another, or at least many of them do. And this is why we call it the redundancy hypothesis. Other species, however, such as keystone species and ecosystem engineers, are very important to the ecosystems. They're more analogous to the pilot, the co-pilot, the navigator, and the flight attendants. The conclusion of this is that protecting the important species should be the highest priority in ecosystems. Protecting others, by analogy the passengers, is also important to ensure ecosystem function. Redundancy provides resiliency when ecosystems are disrupted, which is why we also need to protect the passengers. Okay, let's step back and look at what we've covered so far. There are multiple ways that humans value and rely on ecosystems, and the biodiversity that helps construct ecosystems is essential for our survival and prosperity. And as we've learned through several decades of research, ecosystems provide more and better services when their native species are present and their populations are healthy. These findings are so provocative that the maintenance of biodiversity is assessed to be one of the most important functions of Earth's systems for keeping humanity alive. This figure is from the Stockholm Resilience Center, a group of Earth system scientists concerned with the survival of humanity. This is their famous planetary boundaries model, showing the 9 planetary systems on which humanity depends. On here, you will see fresh water, land use, ocean chemistry, and climate. The figure is constructed like a circular bar chart, where bars are wedges. The length of the wedge represents how much humanity has caused the deterioration of that Earth system. When we keep our impact below the dark dotted line near the center, we stay in the safe zone, where that Earth system can continue to provide what we need. Just beyond that, we are getting into the zone of concern, where our actions are causing changes to the Earth system, and there is increasing risk that we will do harm to our ability to prosper. When our impact reaches beyond the outer dotted line, we are in the high-risk zone, where we are actually jeopardizing our long-term survival. The wedge indicated with the green star is biodiversity. That wedge is subdivided into 2 smaller wedges. The one at the left indicates our scientific uncertainty about what will happen as we eliminate biodiversity in ecosystems. The biodiversity wedge at the right represents species diversity. Already it is judged that we have lost enough biodiversity that the long-term ability of humanity to survive and prosper is in question. Another indication of how important biodiversity and ecosystems are to humanity came out in 2005 with the publication of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment Report. This report was to the United Nations on the state of the world's ecological services. It was a massive effort involving over 2,000 authors and reviewers and scientists from around the world. And it was not written for other scientists. Instead, it was written for government leaders and managers of ecosystems. Some of the things that it covered was the state of our ecological services and how ecological services affect human well-being. The report's findings are not good. To begin with, 60% of the 24 ecological services that were assessed are being degraded or unsustainably used. This includes freshwater availability, fisheries, air and water purification, and regional and global climate regulation. A second major finding is that the degradation of ecosystems are nonlinear, meaning that we get things like positive feedback loops with very negative consequences. And the effects as they act in concert with one another are synergistic. And another important finding is that the world's poor are the ones that are bearing the most of these negative consequences. This is true in the most impoverished parts of the world and true right here in the US. So this is a lot of bad news and scary forecasts. Is there a reason to have hope? Yes, absolutely. Consider that for the first time in human history, we now have the science and the experience from around the world to forcefully make the point that ecosystems and biodiversity are essential to humanity's ability to survive and thrive. Second, more and more people, from school kids to political leaders, are understanding this and taking action. Do enough people understand? No, not by a long shot, but we are getting there. Third, as situations around the world get more and more critical with the loss of biodiversity, people and governments are being forced to respond in ways that ensure that our remaining ecosystems are protected. Finally, there are tens of thousands of scientists out there working on these problems. And there are hundreds to thousands of organizations where people have come together to work on these problems in their communities or globally. Some of these groups are governmental and others are not-for-profit organizations. Progress is being made every day. Ultimately, what happens depends on how we choose to see ourselves in relationship to the environment. As indicated on this chart that you can read from the PowerPoint that will be posted, views vary from viewing the natural world as a set of resources purely to manage for the advancement of humankind, or views that recognize how reliant humanity is on nature and that we are part of the planet's biodiversity, and thus we should act accordingly. Which of these worldviews do you embrace?